price the externality, if you assign a price to carbon, that makes emitting carbon more expensive and people will emit less of it. So that's one way you could use the tax system as a stick. But what I'm going to focus on today is using the tax system as a carrot, instead of taxing bad behavior or pricing bad behavior, rewarding good behavior. So tax incentives can be used as a carrot to promote R&D, adoption of clean technology and practices, and so on. Because one question is, well, why would you do that in the first place? Can't we just rely, if we are going to use a tax system, why do we need carrots? Why can't we just use carbon pricing? And there's a few different reasons. One is just a lack of stringency. You could get there, mathematically and economically, we could meet our Paris commitments just through a carbon price. The difficulty is that you would have to assign a carbon price that would be so high that you would run into political constraints. And just the general public is not necessarily willing to go that far. So you need a variety of other instruments. Secondly, is that clean innovation relative to other forms of innovation has some particular risks. We see policy risk. This is an area where you have a lot of changing policies, not just within Canada, but provincial governments and outside of Canada. There's a fair bit of political risk. Investors tend to shy away from political risk, or at least they need to be compensated more for it. So because of the policy risk, there's technology risk, betting on the wrong technology. It's a very capital intensive industry. You need to have a lot of money to invest in R&D and development and so on of this. So it tends to be an area that, left to its own devices, the private sector will tend to underfund. So there's a role here for government. A big one, I think, is looking at what this does for emissions outside of Canada's borders. One of the difficulties in designing a system for carbon pricing, again, and that could be a carbon tax, cap and trade, what have you, is this problem of carbon leakage or emissions leakage. The idea being that if you have a plant like a chemical plant in Sarnia, Ontario, and they're assessed a carbon price, but their competitor in Port Huron, Michigan isn't, then what could end up happening is that business in Port Huron, ends up taking some of the, being more competitive, takes away some market share from the Sarnia company. So what you've done there under that carbon pricing regime is not lower global emissions, and it's global emissions that we care about. You basically moved emissions from one side of the St. Clair River to the other side of the St. Clair River, which does nothing for global emissions and actually harms Canada's economy. And obviously policymakers at the federal and provincial level spend a lot of time working on designing policies to avoid carbon leakage, but it's not always 100% avoidable. Well, on the tax credit side, you tend to actually have the opposite phenomenon, that instead of carbon leakage, rather the tax incentives that you create actually reduce emissions in other countries. So instead of having a sort of positive carbon leakage, you actually have negative carbon leakage, that your activities actually reduce emissions in other countries. How does that work? Well, if we set up a tax system that accelerates R&D and tech adoption, R&D, I shouldn't say tech, if we accelerate research and development of clean tech in Canada, that's clean tech that can be used across the world. Those are products that we could sell across the world. So we're not just reducing our own emissions, but our companies are helping companies around the world and consumers around the world reduce their emissions. So that's the first, is the R&D side, but there's also the adoption side, that if we accelerate the adoption of clean tech in Canada, that creates economies of scale for the clean tech industry, regardless of where that clean tech is being researched, developed, and produced. It could be being produced here, produced some other country, but we create economies of scale, just by creating a larger market that in the long run drives down prices. We've seen that in the solar market. We've seen that in the battery market, that as these markets grow, companies, there's a learning by doing process. Companies get more efficient at producing solar panels, at producing batteries, and so on. And that efficiency lowers cost, lowers price. So by using tax incentives for clean tech adoption in Canada, we not only increase clean tech adoption in Canada, but we increase clean tech adoption outside of Canada through these learning by doing and price effects. So that's why we might want to use taxes, but then there's a lot of different instruments we could use. So which instrument? Like how do we choose? And the answer is, in part, what problem are you trying to solve? Like, where do you see the bottlenecks to clean tech, growing the clean tech market? Is your problem that you just don't think there's enough financing for startups? Is that the bottleneck, that you've got a bunch of Canadian inventors who have some fantastic ideas and some young entrepreneurs who have some fantastic ideas? They just, for whatever reason, can't get angel funding, they can't get startup funding. Is that the problem you're trying to solve? Or is the problem you're trying to solve that you have a bunch of companies, but they're all really small and none of them can seem to achieve scale? That's a different problem, requires a different instrument. Or is the problem that you're trying to solve, in fact, that you've got great technology, either developed in Canada or developed elsewhere, you just, for whatever reason, can't convince Canadian businesses and Canadian consumers to adopt that technology? That's a third different problem, which requires a different instrument. And in fact, we might see all of these as problems, and we might want to address all of these. But I think we always need to keep in the back of our mind as policymakers, either federally or provincially, what problem are we trying to solve? And this list isn't exhaustive. We could see other issues in the clean tech market. We might think that the problem is actually a lack of skilled labor. Maybe that's a problem we're trying to solve. And we'll discuss that one in webinar 4. So there's other potential problems here. I'm just going to focus on these 3 because these are 3 that lend themselves well to using a tax instrument. So here's the 4 options we're going to look at. I picked these 4 because I believe these are things we might see in Budget 2020, and they show promise. There's good arguments for all of these. So we're going to look at investor tax credits. We're going to look at flow-through shares. We're going to look at accelerated capital cost allowance, or ACCA, for clean tech. And 4th, we'll look at the elimination of import tariffs for manufacturing inputs used by clean tech firms, which doesn't have the nice pithy title as the first 3, but I'm going to argue is just as important. So let's go to the first one. We have a report that came out last summer. It's available on our website, called Tax Incentives to Boost Clean Growth, Investor Tax Credits, and Flow-Through Shares. It has a lot of the details on this that I'm not going to have time to get into. Otherwise, this would be a 6-hour webinar. I'm going to just present the big picture thinking about that. But if you want the details on our first 2 items of this webinar, go check out our report. It's available on the website. So here's how an investor tax credit would look like. So say you're an investor and you're an angel investor and you decide to invest $100,000 in some startup and you receive a 10% equity share. You can, under this investor tax credit, what it allows you to do is expense a certain percentage of that investment against your personal income tax. So if it's a 30% tax credit, what it allows you to do is expense $30,000 of that against your personal income tax. So it lowers the cost of investment because you get this sort of tax benefits from angel investing. And if you if you make something cheaper, you're going to get more of it. So it's kind of the reverse of a carbon price, where we're putting up the price because we want less carbon emissions. Here we're saying, okay, we want more angel investment, and particularly we want more smart money. We want people who are not just investing, but investing and having some skills and knowledge in this area. We'll say, okay, well, we're going to let you figure out what to invest in. But if you find something that's eligible for this tax credit, we will allow you to expense X percentage of that against your personal income tax right up front. And oftentimes that percentage is 30%. So again, why I chose the number 30 is because British Columbia has a version of this. They have their small business venture capital tax credit that offers a 30% tax credit in specific areas, target areas. I believe there's 6 of them. One of them that's Cleantech. So the idea behind it is it's an application process that they have a certain size pool of money every year. And as an investor, you can apply, say, I'm going to invest in company X. I'm going to invest $100,000. Here's what they do. And then the provincial government says, okay, yes or no, that's eligible. And then if it's eligible, you make the investment, you generate the tax credit. There's been studies on the BC program, and it's found that in the long run, it actually generates more tax revenue than it costs, because it accelerates investment in this area. It creates jobs. Those employees pay personal income tax. As a company grows, it pays corporate income tax and so on. So this has had positive results when it comes to job creation and revenue growth, but also tax revenue. That yes, it costs the government money up front, but they recoup more than that in the long run, at least in the BC experience, through increased tax revenue from these companies. So why might the federal government take this approach? Well, one positive aspect of this approach is it's easy for them to emulate. British Columbia, Alberta, and New Brunswick all have variants of these programs. It's in, I think, 25 or so US states. So governments tend to like things that have been adopted in other jurisdictions and have worked well. So here's something they can point to that go, okay, there's already a lot of experience out there with this model. We can just go ahead and do that. And secondly, the really nice thing about this sort of application investor tax credit model is you can make the budgetary size of this as large or small as you want, because it's a limited pool of money. So the federal government could say, okay, I want this to be a $50 million program, or a $100 million program, or a $200 million program. You essentially set the size of the pot, and once the money's gone, it's gone. So you have a fair bit of cost control. It could come under value, but it's not going to spiral out of control on expenses, again, because you're limiting the size of the pot. So that's two aspects where this is a really attractive model. Why this is less attractive? Well, first of all, you have to, this forces the federal government to define, if they're doing this for clean tech companies, well, you have to define clean tech. So you have to set some sort of boundaries, figure out, okay, who's eligible and who's not. So, and in so doing, first of all, you have to pick the definition. And secondly, any definition that you create is going to create winners and losers, because you're creating a sandbox and you're saying, okay, these types of companies are in the sandbox. These ones aren't eligible. And, governments tend not to, prefer, all else being equal, prefer not to have to, tell people that they're not eligible for something. So how they did it in British Columbia is they set a definition of clean tech. A clean technology firm is defined as one substantially engaged in the manufacture and processing and research and development within British Columbia for commercial exploitations of technologies that fit one of these 3 criteria: increase energy efficiency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or reduce the environmental impact of production, generation, storage, transmission, et cetera, et cetera. But again, this doesn't include everything. So they are in some sense picking winners and losers, not at a company level, but at an industry level. So that's the first one. And if I go back to my list, okay, what problem does this solve? Again, this is a very attractive instrument if the federal government believes that the issue or the primary issue is a lack of financing for startups. This is sort of the obvious choice here. So the second one from that report is a flow-through share. And basically how a flow-through share works, and it already exists at some level for Cleantech, is let's say you have a startup company, not a startup, but you have a scale-up company that's making investment in some kind of clean tech in, let's say, renewable energy generation. Well, if that company is a scale-up, they're probably not profitable. So anything that, if they make a $5 million investment, that doesn't benefit their corporate taxes paid at all, because they're not paying any corporate taxes because they're not profitable. So what the flow-through share model allows companies to do is, instead of expensing that against their corporate income tax, they allow that expense to flow through to their investors, and their investors can expense it on their personal income tax. So this already exists. I know that I've got a long list here. So you have this sort of flow-through share model that are available for development costs when 50% of the capital costs fall under these tax classes 43.1 and 43.2. So you have them for a variety of clean tech investments. But the issue here is that this is not, this is not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of things that are not eligible for under this model under current Canadian tax laws. So what you would, what the federal government could do is they could expand the use of flow-through shares, either by expanding the range of eligible activities by saying, okay, actually, here's a bunch of other stuff that we would consider clean tech that would be eligible, or you could build an additional investment. You could layer an additional investment tax credit on top of that. So you're not just allowing 100% of the expense of flow through, but like 115% of the expense of flow through. So you basically allow expensing of greater than 100%, which couples a tax credit on top of a flow through. And we see this in the mining industry. So you could adopt this to clean tech. So why the federal government could take this approach? First of all, it's an expansion of something that already exists. So the government isn't I should back up. Well, I suppose it is an expansion of something that already exists. Either they could expand the list of technologies. So they're just taking the existing technologies and adding to them, or they're going from a 100% model to a 115% model. So in some sense, they are building something new if they go the tax credit route. But again, it builds on an existing structure, which is easier than building something from scratch. Secondly, the flow-through model is popular with investors. Investors like it. This would make the federal government very, very popular with clean tech investors. And so there's some political benefits to doing so. The issues are, first of all, that the flow-through share model is unpopular with many economists. Many economists don't like this model. In part, they largely, the concern here is that you're paying investors to do what they do anyway. That you're not necessarily creating any new investments. You're giving this top up to investors who would be doing these things anyway. And that's a concern with any tax model is, okay, are you actually changing behavior, or are you simply writing checks to people who would have done that behavior anyway? So there's real concerns with the flow-through model and the top-up model that you're actually not getting any new behavior. You're just incenting what already happened. And then secondly, it's non-trivial to expand that list, to try and figure out, okay, how do we expand this? What is eligible? Like, what is clean tech? What isn't? it's a difficult choice. Like once you expand it to 43.1 to 43.2 to an expanded list, you need some sort of method to do that. And we talk about that method in this paper. We also talk about it in the ACCA paper, because as we'll see, extending ACCA has the exact same issues. And finally, you might ask yourself again, because we looked at both of these in the same paper. You go, well, why are there two different instruments? Why do you need investor tax credits, the instrument one, and then a flow through on two? And the answer is they accomplish two different things, and they define Cleantech two different ways. That the investor tax credit it defines the firm as Cleantech. So go back to that again, the sort of angel tax credit. How the investor tax credit defines Cleantech is at a firm level. They go, okay, you are a Cleantech firm, you are not a Cleantech firm. Whereas the flow-through share model is not targeting the firms, but rather targeting the investments. So those are two different things, right? Because you can have a firm that's not a Cleantech firm, but is making an investment in some kind of Cleantech process or so on. So they're looking at two different problems. They're looking at this issue. One looks at it from the firm level. The other looks at it from the physical investment level. And they're essentially accomplishing two different things, because most of the value of the flow through is more for the scale ups. The startups probably aren't doing these large capital expenditures because they don't have the money. And existing firms, the flow through isn't as valuable for them because they're probably making a profit, so they can expense that that Cleantech investment against their corporate profit. So it's less valuable to them. The sweet spot for a flow through is where you have a company, the company exists, they have capital, but they haven't reached scale, and they're still in that pre-profit stage. So if the federal government thought the issue was more scale ups, this is a better instrument. It hits the startups, obviously it hits the adoption of new technologies, but this is kind of the sweet spot for them. Okay, third, accelerated capital cost allowance. So this came out in a different paper, tax incentives to boost clean growth, accelerated capital cost allowance or ACCA. Again, it's on our website. It came out in summer of 2019. So the ACCA, we saw this in budget 2019. I think it was 2019. Yeah, it was 2019. Partially as a response to the Trump tax cut. So there was real concerns that Canadian companies were becoming less competitive with U.S. companies because you had this large corporate tax cut in the United States. So the federal government announced an increase to the depreciation write-off rate of clean energy and manufacturing equipment to 100%. So you basically, if you invest in it, if you're a company and you buy some piece of clean tech, you can write off 100% of that in the very first year and get the full tax benefit for doing so, rather than having to follow a depreciation schedule over time. So again, that gives you an upfront tax advantage. So there's a need to accelerate the adoption of a broader suite of clean technologies across the company, because basically the ACCA defines clean tech the same way as the flow-through shares define clean tech. So it's limited to 19 different technologies and is very energy focused, right? So it misses a lot of stuff. It misses like water treatment and a lot of other areas that aren't specifically energy focused. So it's arguably, and I think it's a good tool to accelerate clean tech investment in the energy sector or energy clean tech, but it misses a lot of stuff. It's very limited. So what the federal government could do is greatly expand the list of technologies. So it could either just expand the list and go, okay, also water treatment, et cetera, is eligible. And again, just have a list and say, okay, if you're on this list, you get the 100% ACCA. Or they could do what other countries have done and set a minimum performance standard, which would be a very broad thing. So it'd be the kind of thing that's like, okay, if there's some refrigerator, let's say, that's 25% or more energy efficient than the average refrigerator for sale, then any company buying this refrigerator could write off 100% of it. Or you could have a hybrid approach that takes it to it's a little bit of both. So countries around the world do these models, either one or the other, or hybrid approach, but basically to expand this list. This solves the market adoption of new technologies problem. So again, if you think that the issue, or the federal government thinks the issue, not so much startup scale-ups, is just getting people to buy this new tech, this is a really good way of going about it. Why they might take this approach? Again, ACCA for Cleantech already exists. So you're just building on an existing model, which is always a little bit easier. It's popular with business owners. The business community seemed very appreciative of the ACCA moves in the previous budget. I'm sure they would appreciate this new move. Most of the fiscal cost is up front. So governments often like this because it doesn't have huge fiscal ramifications in the future. That basically what happens is up front you take a hit because people invest in this, and then over time, in fact, because they depreciate 100% up front, that means they can't depreciate in the future. It's already fully depreciated. So companies pay more in the back end in taxes. Now, this thing would still exist in the future, so there'd be lower taxes in the long run. If somebody's making an investment in 2023, there's lower taxes in 2023, but that nets out the sort of higher taxes that they pay from their investments in 2020. So over time, there tends not to be a huge fiscal cost. Like, most of the fiscal cost is borne in the first couple years of these programs. So governments often like that. They go, okay, well, this isn't, I'm not committing myself to, $500 million in lower revenues, ad infinitum. That most of this, the fiscal cost is in the first 2 or 3 years. And one thing that makes this attractive for the federal government is that a lot of the costs are actually borne by the provinces, or about half the costs are borne by the provinces. Because what the ACCA does is it reduces the taxable income of a company. And because in most provinces, companies use the same definition of taxable income at a federal and provincial level, because this reduces their definition of taxable income, they not only pay less federal corporate tax, but they also pay less provincial corporate tax. So the feds, in a sense, get a sort of double whammy, that they can come out with this policy and kind of force the provinces to follow suit. So this has, the federal government doesn't pay the full fiscal cost of this initiative. They push some of that onto the provinces. So the provinces might not love it, but from the federal government point of view, it makes these fairly attractive tools. Why they might not take this approach? First of all, there's difficulty in expanding the list. Again, just like in flow-through shares, there's always concerns about paying companies for doing what they would have done anyway, just like in flow-through. And there's a third I should add here. I didn't put it on the slide, but I should. The ACCA model is agnostic to where the technology comes from. So if a company buys a piece of clean tech that's manufactured in Germany or China or somewhere else, they still get the ACCA. It doesn't target stuff manufactured in Canada. It's not meant to. I mean, it's just meant to accelerate clean tech adoption. It's not designed to necessarily benefit Canadian manufacturers of clean tech. So, that could be seen as problematic, where the federal government go, no, we want to do something that helps the companies that manufacture it, not necessarily the adoption of it. And in that case, an investor tax credit or flow-through share might be a little bit more attractive than an ACCA. And again, what problem does it solve? The market adoption of new technologies. So finally, the last one. So this is a report that literally came out this week. We did the research on it on behalf of the Toronto Region Board of Trade. So we did the background research. The Toronto Region Board of Trade came out with the paper. And what this paper advocates for is selective tariff elimination. And one of the things that the Toronto Board of Trade is advocating for, that I'm a big advocate of as well, is eliminating tariffs on items used by Canadian clean tech manufacturers, so inputs in production. So import tariffs exist on many components that clean tech manufacturers use in their products, such as thermostats. So if you import thermostats, which is part of a larger piece of, let's say, water purification equipment, and you're the Canadian importer, you have to pay a tariff on that item, or you have to import it tariff-free under a trade deal like CETA or NAFTA. But the problem with the latter, you go, okay, well, if I can just import the stuff tariff-free under CUSMA or the old NAFTA, then is this still a problem? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes, actually, this is still a problem that tariffs exist on this, because it's actually really expensive from a compliance and a red tape perspective to import something that has a tariff on it and then meet the country of origin regulations to allow you to import this tariff-free under CETA or CPTPP or NAFTA or what have you. Again, because what you have to do in order to get NAFTA protection is you have to comply with a whole host of country of origin regulations that involve a great deal of paperwork and record keeping. You have to keep these records for 7 years. You have to obtain this paperwork. You have to be able to show that X% of this, say, thermostat was produced from parts made in a NAFTA country or so on. So it's actually really expensive from a compliance cost point of view to import these goods, even if they're coming in tariff-free under NAFTA, CETA, CPTPP. But there's a really easy solution to that. If you set the most favored nation tariff rate to 0 on that import, then all of those country of origin red tape issues go away. Because now the tax code is agnostic to the country of origin of that thermostat. So you don't need to apply, or not apply, but you don't need to bring this in under some kind of special tariff thing. You just need to bring it in saying, well, it's a thermostat, thermostats, according to the tax code, come in tariff-free, so I don't have to worry about all this country of origin nonsense. And this country of origin stuff is very expensive, particularly for smaller firms. That it's been estimated, and I'll show some of the data on this, or some of the studies on this, that those requirements, those country of origin, the record keeping requirements, and so on, the red tape cost is about 1% of the value of a shipment. So if you're importing $100,000 worth of goods, you're facing red tape costs, compliance costs of about $1,000. Many studies have found higher. I'm quoting the lower ones. I find the lower values still a little bit more plausible. But even so, like 1% is a low estimate. But these costs are not the same for the size of companies. That it's like anything else, you develop economies of scale. So really large importers have all of these systems in place for record keeping, tracking, computerizing, and so on. So that 1% is probably smaller. For small companies, it's probably larger because, again, they don't have the facilities in place to be able to do this to scale. And how we know this is actually through revealed preference. In fact, there are a lot of small and medium enterprises in Canada who will import these technologies or these goods and actually just pay the tax rather than trying to comply with all the paperwork. They're going, well, if the tariff rate is only 3% and and there's all these country of origin issues, all these record keeping issues, and I expose myself to a post-compliant, a post-import audit. That's just too much of a headache. I'll just pay that 3%. So we can confirm that these are real expenses because we can actually observe companies paying the tariff, paying a 2, 3, 4% tariff, rather than trying to comply with the paperwork. So we have real evidence that this causes problems. So there was a paper done by the Conference Board back in 2014 that lists a number of studies on this issue that say, okay, the compliance costs are about 2%, 4%, or so on. I have studied all of these papers. I find that the Kunamoto and Sawchuk research the most compelling. They pin the compliance cost at about 1.05% under NAFTA and the old Canada-U.S. deal. So I think that's a compelling, that is a decent estimate. But note, a lot of these other papers come in with higher values. I find 1% a reasonable estimate. So in this report we did for the Toronto Board of Trade, we used Statistics Canada has a definition of Cleantech, and they assign Cleantech. They say, okay, these are tariff codes associated with Cleantech, either because they're Cleantech themselves or like thermostats. They're used by Cleantech manufacturers. So we took that Statistics Canada definition of like what goods are associated with Cleantech, took all the HS6 tariff codes, and looked for any item where the effective tariff rate, what people actually pay, is less than 1%. And again, it's less than 1% because most of the time they're bringing it in tariff-free under some trade deal. We found 29 active HS6 codes that meet this definition. In 2018, Canadian businesses and consumers imported about $8 billion worth of these goods and paid about $37 million to the federal government in tariffs. This value is going to go down over time as CETA and CPTPP fully kick in. So I think we estimate it'll be about $35 million in 2018, assuming the same level of imports. It's a relatively small number. So it's $37 million on $8 billion worth of imports. So it's like less than 0.5% on average is actually getting paid. Because most of the stuff is coming in tariff-free, but because most of the stuff is coming in tariff-free, if you take 1% of the value of the stuff that's coming in tariff-free, that's an estimated compliance cost of $70 to $80 million. So think about this for a second. We've got all of these tariffs out there that the federal government is only collecting $37 million in tariff revenue from Canadians. But those Canadians not only are paying that $37 million, but are paying an additional $70 to $80 million in compliance costs. Right? So basically the federal government collects $37 million, but the damage to the Canadian economy is over $100 million. Part of that is just the transfer of tax revenue from Canadian consumers and businesses to the government, but some of that is compliance costs. So to my mind, this feels like a no-brainer, right? That we could do something that helps our clean tech firms, only costs the federal government $37 million a year, but provides over $100 million in benefits to Canadians. So why the federal government might do this? First of all, it's relatively inexpensive. $37 million in the grand scheme of things is not a lot of money for the federal government. And secondly, it sends a signal to the world. Like if we start selectively eliminating more tariffs, this sends a signal to the world that Canada believes in free trade and liberalized markets, that other countries in the world are moving in the opposite direction, putting up walls, putting up tax barriers. We can send the signal to the world, no, actually, we're going in the opposite direction. We still believe in trade. We still believe in the value of open markets. Here's a relatively inexpensive way for us to do that. Why they might not take this approach is, first of all, I don't know if it would have occurred to them to use tariff elimination as a way of boosting clean tech. Again, our report, or the Toronto Board of Trade report that I assisted on, only came out this week. So, it's not a lot of time. And, you know, some of these items, some of these 29 items, you know, there may be a political constituency for retention. There might be, again, a Canadian manufacturer of that thermostat that would prefer that tariffs stay in place. So it might, you know, there might be, it would be unlikely on all 29, but there might be one or two or three of these where Canadian companies said, oh, I'd actually prefer if you kept that tariff on. But we think for most, and we looked at this, for most of these goods, there isn't even a Canadian manufacturer, which makes it doubly a no-brainer. So I believe that they'll do this at some point. Just the issue is it probably won't be in budget 2020, just because this is, you know, such a new piece of research. But we're hoping, you know, if not this budget, next budget, that this is a way the federal government could help our clean tech sector. What problem would that solve? Well, a couple of things. So first of all, it'd help with the market adoption of new technologies because it would make those technologies cheaper, because it would lower their input costs. But it'd also help our scale ups because we'd be reducing the cost of that technology, but only for those technologies, because again, these are mostly intermediate goods, mostly for those technologies that are produced in Canada. So it would help lower the cost of our clean tech firms or clean tech scale ups